This was very confusing to me. This was not easy to do. Although the conflicts are probably not what you imagine them to be, so much as just having to mentally change hats each week in that process. But through that process, I learned a lot about conflict management because I was involved in an adversarial system of the law that used conflict as a way of achieving outcomes. And I was in a faith community ministering to people who were hurt over conflict. And so I began to see how each one of these disciplines could learn from the other and could teach about the other thing. And so I began to try to use my ability and my understanding of that context to help other churches. And I began to work in a couple of different capacities. Sometimes I was called to a congregation to work as a consultant to help them to work through a process of conflict management. Sometimes I was retained by the congregation to be an attorney because that's what they needed, because they were in a conflict situation that required some legal advice. Sometimes, with careful disclosure to all the parties that were involved, I was doing a little bit of both. But in my position as general counsel to the Western Reserve Association, which is a large group of churches, UCC churches in Northern Ohio, I had a lot of opportunities to work with churches in this way. And so I want to bring some of the benefit of the things that I learned working with congregations as a consultant and as an attorney in helping them to manage conflict. Now, the presentation I'm making today is probably the least legal of all the other attorneys' presentations, because the subject that we're talking about, while it has a few legal principles and a few legal repercussions, it's more about the community of faith and how we do a particular kind of process in that context. A word about resources. The king of conflict management and the queen of conflict management in the church is the Alban Institute. And you should know about the Alban Institute. They have done more study and research than anyone else about this whole topic. They have a website, they have a wonderful publishing company, and if you write to them, they'll send you this really nice collection of their writings. I encourage you to get those and to read those and look at those. I'm going to refer to one of their books, not generally available in bookstores. You have to get it from Alban. It's called Conflict Management in Congregations, edited by David Lott. And I like this book in particular, although they've got many good books about conflict management, because it is a collection of articles from different authors, each coming at conflict management in the church from a different perspective. And I'm going to be, this afternoon, reading occasionally from this book some small excerpts that I think are so good. Why reinvent the wheel? Why reinvent the wheel on this when we have this kind of expert advice? Okay, first thing. Conflict and managing conflict is really about managing change. Managing change. Change is all around us. It's in us. It's part of the human process. It's part of the process of the church and congregations. It's what moves the universe in so many different ways. And conflict arises out of having to deal with change. Sometimes we want change to happen. We want something about our congregation to change in a more positive direction, or in a way that we feel more comfortable being as a church. Sometimes we want to hold change back. We want to stop change from happening because we like it the way it was before, right? We like it the way we had church when we really liked the way church was. And now it's becoming something else, and we don't want it to go there. So learning about change is going to be the dynamic model I'm going to talk about. And under here, we're going to talk about several things. You know, I organized this according to this scheme. You could do it a million different ways, but I like this way. So care, heal, anticipate, name, goodness, and engage. And so as I move through the conversation today, I'm going to move through these elements, and they won't be in order, and I'll jump around, but that's okay. We can do that. I want to start out by talking about three true stories of things that happened in a church. The first one is when a group of people in a congregation became concerned about changes that were happening in the worship service. They noticed that the pastor of the church had begun to change the worship service. He started to put up a projector and a screen to do things during the worship service. He started having some music that had guitars and more contemporary music. He started referring to God as Mother, Father, God, and using inclusive language in places, even in the biblical texts, that had male pronouns. And so a group of the congregation didn't feel comfortable with that. So they came to the pastor to express their disagreement. And the pastor did a really interesting thing. He could have said, I'm in charge of the worship. I get to decide what the worship is going to be. I'm the expert. I went to seminary. I learned the history of liturgy. And I know what worship is about. We have to communicate with young people if we want young people to come here. He could have said all those things, but he didn't. What he said was, tell me about what some of your concerns are. One woman spoke up and she said, you know, there's certain older hymns that I like to sing, and I wish that we could sing those again. I like those hymns. Another spoke up and said, we know that you have a certain responsibility and expertise in doing worship, but we would like a say as a congregation about the style of worship that we have. So he said, let's talk about this. What we could do is, I would like for you to make a list of the hymns that you really like to sing. And we're going to include one of those hymns at least from that list every week or 2 weeks in the service. And he said to the person who had recommended that the whole congregation participate in the worship process, he said, you know, I feel very strongly about some of the things that I want to do with worship, and I have good theological reasons for doing them, but I would like to have a worship committee where people can contribute ideas about what direction we're going with worship styles. And even more important, so that we can have a discussion about why we want to have that worship style, why it's important to move in a certain direction. That's one story. The next story is about a woman pastor, and a young man came into her office one day, and he announced to the pastor that he was a young gay man, and that he felt very strongly that though he had been welcomed into this congregation, that they should consider becoming open and affirming. Are any of your congregations gone through the process of becoming open and affirming? Okay. And he said, I think we should get the church together and we should take a vote on this, and so that we can become open and affirming. And the pastor said, you know, I hear your concerns. I hear what you're saying, and I want you to feel welcome here and included here as a child of God, irregardless of your sexual orientation. But here's what we're going to do. We're not going to take a vote. We're going to take a year to study, to be a congregation that's in conversation about what this issue says. We're going to look at every single one of the biblical passages that speaks to this issue. We're going to bring people in who are experts, people who are gay, but also psychologists and people who have written about this issue. And we're going to talk about the reasons why people have a reaction to that out of their own traditions. And not only that, but we're going to select certain people from the congregation so that this group, this study group, is representative of all of the factions in our church. So we're going to have some of our elders, some of our older people. We're going to have some youth. We're going to have some people who have served as church leaders. We're going to have some people who have been involved in voting on controversial subjects or issues that we've had come up in the church. And we're going to work at that. And when we get to the end of that year, then we're going to decide if it's something that we want to act on. And I want to assure you that I think that if we have really engaged in that process, people will come naturally to a point at which they feel comfortable about what they're doing. They will feel that they've been heard. They will feel that they participated. They will learn because they will find out some new things about their gay brothers and sisters that they didn't know before. And they'll feel ready, and then we'll take a vote. And the congregation went through this study group process, and at the end of their time, they decided that yes, they were ready to move forward with becoming open and affirming, and they voted. There were 2 families in the congregation that voted against it. But the overwhelming majority felt comfortable with it because of the process that had taken place. Now, in these first 2 stories, these were very positive outcomes from a conflict management process that came largely from the pastors, but included all the people in the church. Those were examples, true life examples, of how potential conflict was used to move the congregation forward and also to do some things that prevented them from getting into a terrible fight. That doesn't always happen, as we all know. How many people here might say, and I'm going to ask you questions from time to time, and if you want to ask any yourself, just pop right up and ask your questions. But I may ask you something. If you don't feel comfortable raising your hand or responding, don't worry about it. I'm just kind of getting a sense from you. How many of you have been in a church conflict that you thought was pretty serious and pretty difficult? A lot of hands there, a lot of hands. And part of the reason why those situations become difficult are because of the stages in which a conflict develops. And the sooner we act, the less possibility there is for something very difficult emerging toward the later stages. So we want to anticipate church conflict We want to anticipate change because we know it's coming. We know it's coming. It's going to come in one form or another. So let's get ready for it. Let's start acting and behaving as though it's something that we can work on. Now, maybe your congregation isn't interested in becoming open and affirming, and that's not an issue for you. But maybe there's another issue that you're working through that needs attention, and you need to do the same kind of process. That's where we take our time and do it in a way that will have a good outcome. Okay, I said there was a third story. There's something that I wanted to kind of divert to for just a second, and that's about cultural sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity to conflict in a congregation that is sensitive to the cultural, ethnic, racial diversity that's within the congregation, and also sensitive to the particular history and tradition of that congregation. So some congregations get in a rut where they keep repeating the same patterns over and over and over again. And that's part of their DNA. And somewhere along the line that has to get broken and something new replace it. When it comes to cultural sensitivity in an ethnic sense, we need to know that certain groups of people, depending on their own heritage, their own upbringing, their own experiences, have a different way of dealing with conflict than others. And I'm going to give you this third story from one that was written up by one of the authors in this book, Versten Choi. He wrote a very, very interesting article called From Surgery to Acupuncture, an alternative approach to managing church conflict from an Asian American perspective. Now, I want to be careful to say that I'm not saying that this would be similar to a group that's within your congregation. I'm using it as an example because Versten Choi has centered in on what particular way an Asian American congregation dealt with conflict that may be different from a sort of Western point of view that's not sensitive to cultural differences. So wanting to explore the theme, improving harmony and communication in the church, an Asian American congregation invites a white counselor to be the keynote speaker for its annual all-members retreat. The speaker focuses one of the sessions on intergenerational communication. To encourage openness and sharing, the speaker asks the youth present to identify issues about which they and their parents disagree. No youth responds. The speaker rearranges her audience, asking the adults to sit on one side of the room and the youth to sit on the other. She then rephrases the question to the youth, think about the last time you and your parents had an argument. What was about? Still, no youth responded. One of the adults new to the congregation tries to help. Maybe the youth need more time to think up some things to say. Maybe they need anonymity. How about if we break into two groups, one for the youth and one for the adults, for the next half hour so that each generation can come up with a list of what bugs them about the other generation. Each group could choose its own reporter so that we won't know who actually made the complaint in the first place. The retreat leader agrees with the suggestion. They divide into two groups and they meet. 30 minutes later, they come back. The youth are given the opportunity to report first, and the reporter reads from a small piece of paper, quote, as the youth generation of this church, we appreciate the opportunity to share our opinions at this retreat. However, what our parents and we disagree about, well, we don't feel it's right to bring that up in public. We love our parents. What we argue about is between us. She looks to the other youth. They nod in agreement. She turns back to the audience, says thank you, and returns to her seat. Versten Choi goes on to say that the interpersonal relationships in an Asian American congregation are different and that those dynamics mean that it's more difficult to engage directly and personally to talk about conflict. And that is true for some people in congregations. They don't all deal with conflict in the same way, and our process has to be sensitive to that. And no matter how your congregation is made up, one method of conflict resolution may not work as well as another one. It may require an intermediary or a facilitator or a mediator of some kind to be able to have groups to communicate one with the other. Just one more sort of statistical thing about how our churches are being formed nowadays and how this impacts also on our process.
Rick?
Yes.
Are you going to make a suggestion about what might have worked?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
No, I want you to give us one.
Oh, if I had a suggestion.
Well, or Burston or whoever.
He says, he takes this metaphor of surgery and acupressure and says that he would have suggested a process that's more like acupressure or acupuncture and not like surgery. Something that's less invasive, that's not cutting away, that's dealing with a small pinprick, but not a big invasive process. And so he says that is going to take a kind of mediation in which the parties are able to confront whatever their problems and issues are without losing face, without losing their dignity and their respect for one another. And so it requires that sort of different process. But I would commend the article to you to read as a sort of great example of doing conflict where there's cultural diversity. More and more congregations report that between 40 and 60% of their new members do not come from the same denominational background as the congregation that they're joining. They may not understand why the congregation works as it does because of its history or its practice. But they do come with some expectations of how they would like to see it work. These are real differences. Increasingly, congregations are receiving new members who not only have no denominational experience to match the history of their new church, they have no congregational experience at all. Not only don't they know how this congregation behaves and what it believes, they are not sure what to expect from any congregation. This group may not be sure what its new church home is prepared to offer, but they are sure that they are seeking something and are willing to articulate it for themselves, their children, or the kind of world in which they hope to live. Trends continue to show that more and more people are joining large churches, yet ours has been a national history of small congregations. Experience continues to say that the size of a congregation is the most critical variable in determining how it behaves, and that congregations of very different sizes behave in very different ways. This is especially true regarding communications, decision-making, programs, etc. So there are some people with small church expectations, large church expectations, non-church expectations, depending on the congregational experience that the church members bring to their present congregation. This makes a big difference because the way people come to your church determines what their expectations are about how you will deal with conflict and do a variety of other things. The example about the worship experience, they may come with an expectation that worship is this because they've been in a church that had very high church liturgy. Or they may come expecting a more contemporary service because that's what they were used to. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with those changes? Well, one thing I talked about was anticipation. And everything that all of the attorneys have said in all of their workshops today are things that you can do that will help to anticipate conflict. And no place is that greater than in how your documents and your processes and your policies talk about how you're going to deal with conflict. So you're going to go back after this meeting is over, and you're going to look at your Constitution and your bylaws and other policies that you have that talk about what happens when you have a conflict. What do you do? And what kind of votes have to be taken? And what percentages of those votes have to be in place in order for a decision to be made? That's one way of anticipating conflict, because if you get those prepared in a way that anticipates the problems that you might have, then you'll be in a better position to deal with them. You want to consult the wise souls in your congregation. In the Bible, they call these presbyters or elders. But every congregation has wise souls, and they usually know more about the history of the church and its tradition and how it's dealt with problems in the past. And having conversation with them and honoring them and learning from them is a great way to prepare and anticipate what happens with church conflict. Occasionally, you may want to get to a point where you're bringing in a consultant, possibly an attorney, if you're anticipating litigation, or even if you need guidance around employment matters in particular, but any conflict that's caused by a disagreement about the rights and responsibilities of the congregation. The insurance board, as Kathy explained, has a wonderful risk management consultant that can also talk to you about some of these things. I want to talk about something around the process of what happens in the development of a church conflict. And this comes from research done by a PhD psychologist and pastor, Methodist pastor named Tim Savage. And he talks about parishioners going ape. Anxiety-provoking event. Church conflicts are often caused because a member or a member family has an anxiety-provoking event in the congregation. Someone has said something which is offensive to them. Someone has done something which is offensive to them. Maybe they've experienced something in the life of the church and they go to complain about it or to talk to somebody about it, and they're not responded to. They're just left hanging out there with their problem. He says, Tim Savage says, that what happens is that that person will gradually withdraw from the church most of the time. If someone gets to them within 60 to 90 days, he's actually measured this, they're 90% likely to come back into the fellowship just because they've been responded to, listened to, and heard. He talked about this in terms of restoring inactive church members. You know, a lot of our church members who've become inactive are really people that met with conflict in the church and just decided, I'm not going to deal with that, I'm going to get out of this. I'm going to withdraw, I'm going to leave. I'm going to reduce my pledge. I'm going to stop giving altogether to the church. I might leave my name on the rolls, but I'm not coming to worship. Those people are a signal. They're a blaring signal. Keep your attendance records. They're a signal that something is going on, that something is going wrong, and we need to pay attention to that. Caring is the most important thing about managing change and conflict. Caring for the beloved community. We need to learn to value differences rather than trying to ignore them or blend them. Value our differences. We're different. People in a congregation are different. And rather than ignoring those differences or trying to blend them out of existence, we need to value them. Value the contribution that each and every member brings to the table. Another thing that happens besides anxiety-provoking events, for which the only cure is to hear and respond to the individual, is how people sometimes over a period of time will store up tokens. They will have experiences in the church and they're remembering that and they're putting it in their bag and they're remembering that and they're putting it in their bag. And then finally that bag gets too heavy to carry and again, something happens. Perhaps they'll leave or walk out. Perhaps they'll circulate a petition. Have you ever had that happen? That happens in a lot of churches where a group of people get together and they make up a petition, and the people that are driving the petition think that if they get people to agree with their point of view and sign the petition, that then the church will have to do something about this problem. Nominating processes. People will move to get on the nominating committee or control the nominations so they can get the church leaders lined up in the offices that will compare with what they want to have done. So when you see that happening, then you know something's afoot, right? They'll call the conference office and they'll complain to the conference minister. Can you please come and tell these people that they're doing this wrong? Or come do something about this conflict. And I encourage you to call your conference minister. And your conference minister can often be very, very helpful in helping you to design a process to deal with problems like this. But that's also a sign, if somebody has done that, that they're experiencing a problem. The other thing that happens is there'll be a call for a vote on something. And the problem with the call for a vote on anything is that some people are going to vote for and some people are going to vote against, and the ones that vote against will never be happy with the decision. They'll feel just as alienated. So if there's some process that you could get involved with before it comes to a vote, that's what you want to do. And there are two. One is called collaboration, and the other is called negotiation. Collaboration is a wonderful process because what collaboration does is it gets people together to try to come to a consensus about what to do, about the issue that's confronting them. And they work together to come out with a mutually agreeable solution. So when you collaborate to come up with a solution, you don't get into some of these more difficult phases or stages of conflict. Instead, you create a consensus that everybody can move forward with. Sometimes you can't get a collaboration because the process has already gone too far in terms of creating factions that are fighting with one another, and they won't give up on their position, one side or the other. You know, one group wants to get rid of the choir director or the pastor, and the other group loves the pastor and the choir director, and so they're at loggerheads. And so you have to go to negotiation. What's different about a negotiation from a collaboration is that each side has to give up something to trade for something that they want. So this is a little bit more painful than collaboration, but it can work. There are some things that work with negotiation and some things that don't work as well. I want to just share this real quick with you. Negotiation is the decision-making strategy to use when collaboration fails, but only go to that when it does fail. Work on collaboration first. Here we assume that arriving at a mutual agreeable solution will not be possible, but that each group might get something it wants, though it will be only a part of what the group hopes for. Negotiation can only occur when there is something that can be divided or exchanged. It is not possible to bargain over a baby, as in the story of Solomon. Some things can't be split in two. You have to be willing to trade decisions in one realm for decisions in another. Okay, we'll vote for this if you will agree to vote for that. Negotiation doesn't work very well on theological issues, values, or issues of integrity. It is most awkward to trade a theological conviction about the virgin birth for a belief regarding Jonas being swallowed by the big fish. That's another problem. Negotiation is a backup strategy to collaboration. If we can't arrive at a decision that will be satisfactory to almost everyone, then we can attempt to make trade-offs. This is most often done in churches over budget items. So if you're having an argument about financial things, this works pretty good, because some people are going to give up some things that they want to spend money on or save money on, and others the other side. Okay, getting to these solutions of collaboration, negotiation. What's helpful? To have a process and a plan. And this is where church leaders have the most difficulty, because they don't feel that they have the knowledge or the understanding of the conflict management process to come up with that. So you might need some help with that. You might need some help from the conference minister, or you might need some help from a consultant, or you might need to consult with somebody that's in your church that has an idea about human interaction processes, organizational development, that sort of thing. To design a process and a plan, and there are certain things that have to be in that process or that plan. One of them is having a safe environment where people can talk and discuss these issues without fear of repercussion. So there has to be ground rules for the discussion to take place. There are certain things that you want to have in place to be able to do that. Let me just find this. Okay. You want to have clear ground rules. You want to have agreement as to who will participate. Will it just be the board, or will it be a broader group of people? You may want to include in the constituency the people who are part of the ones that are having problems with the issue. You need ample time to work through the issues. You need the participation of all the key leaders in the church. You need to clarify as to what the process is that you're using. And you have a hope that the group will be able to find a mutually satisfactory solution, meaning that, again, this positive promotion of the idea that, yes, conflict can be hurtful and it can be a bad thing, but if we work on this together, we can get something achieved. We can do something.
See this quickly again?
Yes.
The list again?
Yeah, I'll give this list again. Have clear ground rules, agreement as to who will participate in the discussion, ample time set aside to work through the issues, participation of all the key leaders, a clarification as to the process that you're going to use, and a hope that the group will be able to find a mutually satisfactory solution. I mentioned a couple of other areas in the original little anagram thing about change, so I want to make sure I go back and get those. Naming a problem. One of the things that we need to do is create problem definitions. What is the definition of the problem that we're having? And here's a good way to get at that. You're asking the question, who is doing what? Who is not doing what? Who feels what? So you ask these three questions to begin to identify what the problem is. Who is doing what that's causing difficulty? Who is not doing something? Who feels what? In answering these questions, we'll begin to give you a problem definition. And that's an important part also. Now, naming the problem openly can sometimes have repercussions because people are fearful that if we call it out, then it's going to be hurtful. But not doing that means that you're not going to get at the root of what the problem is. And so you need to ask those questions. I mentioned also the principle of goodness, and this has a lot to do with our intent, our position, and our interest. And I'm going to read three little examples of this, where position and interest are different. Let me just... And I think this is really, really key. Okay, on the one side, here's the position. The choir director should be fired. Okay? The choir director should be fired. That's the position. So somebody is saying that in the life of the church. And they're saying, let's take a vote or let's do something to handle that situation. Listen to what the interest is behind that position. We never hear any of the old hymns at our service. I'd like that as a part of my worship experience. In other words, what the person is stating as the problem or their position that they've taken has a reason behind it that has to do with something that they're feeling is lacking. And that's what you have to get at in order to be able to deal with the conflict over their position. And the only way that that's going to happen is if there is a listening opportunity. So in every conflict management resolution process, there has to be a listening conference. There has to be an opportunity for people to express what their real interest is. If someone says, get rid of the pastor, then there's something behind that. What is it that the pastor is doing that they're not comfortable with? What is it that the pastor did that they feel has been hurtful to them in some way, shape, or form? And I'm going to talk more about pastors in particular in a moment here. Okay, another one. Let's try another example. I won't serve on a committee chaired by him or her. I won't serve on a committee if that person is running it. What they're saying in their interest is, I don't feel listened to or respected by that person. In fact, I'm intimidated because of how I often was interrupted and talked over in our last work experience. So it's not that they don't want that committee to be restructured in some way. What they're saying is that the process that the committee used and the leadership style of the committee chair was not allowing me to express my ideas and my feelings. And so getting at that real underlying problem is what is going to get to the conflict management. The listening. Another example, the new secretary isn't as efficient as the last one. And the interest underlying that is this. The new secretary doesn't do things like they used to be done. I used to hear from the pastor the same day I called without even having to ask. So they had a particular interest in mind when they were actually complaining about the secretary and wanting a change there. And so that is something that you also have to look for. What is the difference between the position that they're taking, the hard line that they're taking, and what really underlines that? There's a number of things that people do that aren't helpful to that process. If they withdraw from the conversation, if they make up information, if they are conducting secret meetings, if they're sending anonymous communications, are they triangulating? That is, they come up to you and say, do you know what so-and-so is doing? because they're not talking to the real person that they should be talking to. So how do you deal with those problems? Those problems have to be dealt with in the process, where the group that is engaged in the listening process and in the leadership of that process says, we're not going to accept any anonymous communications. If it's not signed, we're not going to consider that. We're going to have an information session to make available to people the information about what's going on so that they can't make up stuff that is not true. We're going to not have secret meetings. We're going to have meetings that are called, that everybody knows about in advance, where, when, and how, and we're going to invite people to participate in that. So we need to cut all of those things off at the pass in developing our process. Okay, one of the ways in which we inject goodness into the process, the goodness that is part of faith, is to call upon what our mission is. And this is another way of anticipating conflict, but also with dealing with it, is calling people to responsibility in their faith. And there's a wonderful little statement about that also. Since the primary language of our society is one of aggression, self-interest, competition, and hostility, putting our faith into action requires that we learn to speak a second foreign language, as it were. This idea is familiar to us as Christians who follow a vision that is by definition countercultural. The world's values are not ours. Our society's predominant language is not a language of caring. And so we seek a place where caring is spoken, where peacemaking and faith are shared and encouraged. Thus we see the church ideally as a center of caring to which we come remembering that we are in the world but not of it. In Paul's list of the fruits of the Spirit appears the word agatha sune, which is usually translated goodness. A more accurate translation might be virtue equipped. Goodness is equipped to address a world with other values and priorities. Part of the equipment is a language of caring skills that can be exercised in the church and in the world. Speaking a language of caring is not valued by the world at large, so we need some place where that language is shared and encouraged. For me, that place is the church. And sometimes we need to be called to that and called back to it and reminded of it. And the pastor can do that, and the church leaders can do that, and our wise souls and elders can do that, and they should. They should always keep reminding us as we're going through these difficult processes of resolution of the goodness that is part of the caring, which is our mission. So what can you do practically about that? Well, you could have the church, the congregation, identify its organizing principles by coming together to reevaluate or to create a mission statement, to engage the congregation in a process of saying what its mission is, where it should be focusing its attention in its ministry and in the world, and focusing that on their common values and their common hopes. And that really, really helps to anticipate conflict and even deal with it during the process of resolving that conflict. Okay, let's talk a little bit about our favorite subject of conflict in the church, the pastor. The leadership of the church. I used to wonder when I was dealing with church fights and church situations where people were arguing about, should we keep this pastor, should we get rid of this pastor? Some people like the pastor, some people don't. And sometimes there would be a vote, and those votes are terrible because some people are saying in the discussion prior to the vote, this is why I don't like this pastor. And others are fiercely loyal to the pastor, and so they're making their argument. And I used to wonder, how can one person have so many people that love that person so much and value that person's ministry so much, and then there are these other people over here that don't? How can that happen? And there are two factors I'd like to mention to you. These are obvious and I know you know them, but they're very, very important. One, in a congregational system like that of the United Church of Christ and in your congregations, a pastor has however many bosses as there are members of the church, and they all get to vote on whether that pastor gets to keep their job or not. So if you're the pastor and you're trying to curry favor with those people, what do when you have a matter of principle that tells you that you need to go in a certain direction? If you're a pastor and you feel passionately out of your theological and faith understanding that the church should move this way, then how do you compromise that in order to prevent and protect your employment? That puts pastors in a congregational system in a very, very difficult situation. And they have to be really, really creative in that system to bring people with them. And the really good pastors and the ones that survive most conflicts are the ones that are really good at rallying support, bringing the people with them, having the skill to work with a wide variety of people. But when you've got a group that's kind of chomping at your tail and complaining and so forth, it's very hard for you as a pastor, and this is number two, to minister to and care for those people. Think of how you would feel as a pastor at having to go and visit, whether it's in the hospital or their home or someplace, someone who is a chronic complainer about your ministry, and having the objectivity to minister to that person in a way that is faithful to them. That is a very difficult thing to do. So what ministers are tempted to do is to ignore that person and maybe not call on them and maybe not minister to them. And that makes the situation worse because then they feel like they have been abandoned by their pastor. So these dynamics create a very difficult situation in church conflicts that arise around pastoral issues. Now, I'm not talking about issues of misconduct here. Now, misconduct can be a real severe source of conflict that has to be dealt with in its own way. It has to be carefully investigated by the church if there are any allegations of misconduct by a pastor. And that's a little bit different situation that I'm not going to go into detail about today, but I did want to mention what are some of the things we can do about this other problem. Well, one thing to do is to do a kind of pastoral activities index. Well, what the heck is that? Okay. My name tag won't stay on. One very creative pastor came up with this idea. Now, many churches are doing it. Again, it's going to require the cooperation of the pastor. They're going to have to be able to deal with having other people talk about what it is that he or she does. But they're going to talk about that anyway. So you might as well bring it out in the open. Okay, pastoral activities. What are 30 responsibilities that a pastor has that are important to people? Things like calling on members, things like leading worship, things like being involved in community organizations. Whatever 30 things that you might come up with as a group, a pastoral relations committee, or some group within the church that talks about this, maybe the whole board will set aside a special time to do this. And then they will each year meet to prioritize 10 out of those 30 that the pastor is called to concentrate on during the coming year. And the other 20 are going to be covered some other way, through lay leadership, through a committee, or through some other source of ministry. Then when people complain, the pastor isn't doing this, the leadership of the church can say, we went through a process where we identified where we wanted our pastor to give priority. And he or she is doing those things, and we will support you in these other areas the best we can with lay leadership and other sources. What that does is, it's not going to solve the problem completely, because you always have some chronic complainers about what the pastor's doing with their time and how good and competent they are at using that. But what this does is it brings out in the open a discussion and a process that people can engage in about what they really think it's important for their pastor to be doing. The pastor's got to stand up for his or her own position and say, well, I don't feel comfortable doing that thing as a priority or not doing it. But then you can negotiate that a little bit with the pastor until you arrive at this list of 10 priorities that he or she is going to focus on in the coming year. And at the end of that year, you reevaluate, and maybe you're going to shift some of those into different priorities. That's an example. It's only one example of a way that we can start to address this issue. That we know our pastors are taxed and don't have time to do everything that we would love for them to be able to do. And so let's be reasonable with them. Let's say, here are the things that we think are most important for you to be about. And it gives people an opportunity to say what it is that they need from their pastor. There are situations in which we are moving on down the line in the process of what we're going to do about a particular pastor if we feel that a change is needed. Because there are times when there is a kind of breakdown in the relationship for one reason or another. And sometimes this will get to a very difficult situation in which people have to think that they need to vote on the termination of the pastor's services or take some other kind of drastic action with that. I think that the important thing there is that people have to be involved in this process of continuously communicating about their expectations and have a process for moving, and not put people in a situation where they're going to have to vote one way or another to keep or not to keep this pastor. And that's by focusing on the ministry of the church. What's good for the church going forward in terms of developing a mutual ministry of pastoral staff and the congregation's mission. Sometimes a pastor will feel the pressure and they will make a change themselves in terms of a resignation. I used to say as a lawyer to congregations, never ever turn down a resignation of a church employee, pastor or otherwise, because once they've made a voluntary decision to leave, why would you want to call it back when you can dispose of the problem and nothing's going to come from that because they've decided to leave? That's really sort of overgeneralizing and insensitive to a situation. But I would say to you, anytime that you're presented with a resignation where there's a conflict between that person and the congregation, you ought to think very carefully, should we just accept this and move on and build toward the future in terms of the leadership that we want, or do we need to have some more negotiation and conversation? Because what will happen sometimes is that the pastor resigns, then finds support from the people who are upset, that feel that the pastor was forced to resign, and then encourages him to come back into the picture, and then they say they want to take back their resignation and go forward being the pastor. Then you're back into a kind of mess. So dealing with that situation sometimes can be a situation where you want to consider whether resignation is an appropriate action at that time or not. There's this kind of scale in ministerial leadership from authoritative to consultative on either end of the spectrum. So you have a pastor who is very, very authoritative. My way or the highway. This is what I believe. This is what I'm going to do. Don't like it, get out of town. That's at one extreme, okay? Not many people are actually like that, but that's one extreme. The other extreme would be somebody who gives up all their power, gives up all of their power and relinquishes it to the congregation and, oh, I'll do whatever it is that you need me to do. And I'm going to stay away from conflict by not doing anything. And we have to realize that these are styles of leadership and that we as a congregation may be more comfortable with one or the other or some gradation of that in between. And so when we're in conflict with the pastor, we want to look at what is the style of leadership that the pastor has so that we can engage about whether that's what we really need and want to have in a style. Do we want a pastor who is continuously communicating, touching base with us, moving forward with us, leading us in a way that is strong and yet open and listening? Obvious legal issues here relate to the many documents that may apply to the employment relationship that you have with the pastor. Now, there is this thing that's called a ministerial exception, which is a legal principle that comes out of the First Amendment that says that the government's not going to interfere with our call, our ordination, our employment of pastors, because that would be an undue interference, or establishment of religion. And so we don't have to fear about that particular process, but what we do need to be concerned about is the process that we use, whether it's the one that we state that we will use in our policies. So every congregation has this sort of array of documents. They have a call letter. They may have another type of agreement or contract with that pastor in addition to the call letter. They may have something in their constitution about a process that will be used if the pastor is going to be asked to leave or terminated. And there may be an employment policy. Although usually those employment policies are meant for non-pastoral staff, sometimes they have things in them about the pastoral staff. So you need to go back and look at those and see where they're in conflict and have a broad understanding of what's all included in them, because they could all be used to govern the employment relationship that you have with a pastor. And it's the one thing that courts usually, I'm not a Hawaii lawyer, so I can't say about state law here, but is usually, in most jurisdictions, the one thing that courts will peer into, whether you have followed the process that you've stated in your documents and in your policies when you're dealing with the employment of your pastor. So I just wanted to mention that. Anybody ever have fights in their congregations over construction projects or copier leases or
Paint color.
independent contract, paint colors? These are things that come up all the time. And it's actually a place where your attorney might be really helpful in sorting through the relationship you're having with an outside party as it relates to it. It's always hard to have, shifting gears here, hard to paint the church by committee, but those little things hopefully are things that we can find ways to deal with in collegiality and in a kind of process that we work on together. One other dilemma that we deal with often in this conflict management is the fundamental paradox and tension between order and freedom. Order and freedom. We need order in our congregations, but we also want people to be free to express themselves, to believe what they want to believe, to be able to participate in their congregation's life the way they want to, and to have differences, both personal differences between themselves and other people, and personal differences in their opinions about things. So how do we maintain this balance between order and freedom? And congregations, like human beings, live between the polarities of order and freedom. Between these two fundamental requirements lies the stage upon which the history of the people of God has played out. So this is kind of a biggie. The tension between order and freedom has birthed the great stories of the Bible and framed the historical struggles of the church. The tension is reflected in the order and structure established in the Bible and the later response of the prophets, who both embraced the Bible and pointed to the need for change. The tension is reflected again in the post-exilic freedom symbolized in Ruth as a model of the new diversity within the people of God. The tension surfaced again when Jesus challenged the established rules about table fellowship and sought to enlarge the circle of responsibility and acceptability. The Gospel of Matthew depicts Jesus as the embodiment of this very tension between order and freedom. Matthew's opening genealogy describes Jesus as both the son of David and the son of the new human being. In this tension, the church continues to evolve and carry faith to the next generation. When congregations live between order and freedom, not allowing the excesses of either to dominate, an atmosphere is created in which different voices and approaches are honored. The tension becomes something life-giving, creative, and renewing as the internal variety encourages the benefits of both order and freedom. What we want to be able to do, finally, in the last analysis, is to be able to ask the purposeful questions that the church needs to ask. Who are we and who are we called to be? What are we called to do in this chapter of our history as a congregation? What are the goals and or the objectives that we set out to accomplish in our ministry? What are the appropriate strategies for our ministry, and how will we measure its attainment? These are the important, purposeful questions that the church asks. And we need to focus our attention and our processes on those things and not over fighting over them. We'll still have fights. We'll still have to deal with change. We'll still have to come up with a process of collaboration where we come to a consensus over these questions, but always redirecting ourselves back to those purposeful things. I have talked enough. I will be glad to provide any of you with an outline of what I talked about today. If I can either leave it with Charles, or if you ask me personally, or give you your email, I'll send it to you. But I really thank you for your time and your attention, because it's a big, big topic. Now, do any of you have questions or want to tell me stories about experiences that you've had that we could share in wisdom?
Will you list the purposeful again, can you please?
Yes. Who are we and who are we called to be? What are we called to do in this chapter of our history as a congregation? What are the goals that we set out to accomplish in our ministry? What are the appropriate strategies for our ministry, and how will we measure its attainment? And you can find these in this article that's part of the book I mentioned. The Illusion of Congregational Happiness is the name of the article, which is an interesting article. Again, conflict management in congregations. Conflict Management in Congregations. It's edited by David Lott. It's available from the Alban Institute. The Alban Institute also has professional consultants that will come to your church and help you design a process to work through a conflict resolution. They may or may not be affordable in your church budget, so you may find other consultants that do this kind of work that are more within your budget, but usually consultants aren't very helpful in the beginning stages if the church can do a collaboration. And if you get to a later stage where you see that you're really having difficulty, consultants may be more valuable, but that's just part of my experience. Yes, over here. Yes, absolutely. I think it's important to have someone with church experience. Yes, she was asking that if you have outside help with a church conflict, is it better for them to have church experience and knowledge? And I say definitely yes. It's definitely true with the attorneys who are assisting our Association of Conference Attorneys because they have an intimate knowledge not only of the church, but also of the United Church of Christ and its congregational polity. And so they're able to bring to bear resources and understandings, and particularly know how to educate courts about our differences. That is invaluable. But I think that's true also of non-attorney consultants in conflict management, that the more background that they have working with churches in particular, because they're very different animals to deal with, and you really need that. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's quite a question, but can you speak to this? I feel sometimes that our culture has become more and more polarized, that people tend to approach life or life situations more and more as, opposing others who feel or think differently. You got to dig your trenches and do battle with each other. I'm thinking that there are people, even in our families, much less our congregations, who cannot live without conflict. And I realize conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know that. But I'm wondering, it seems possible for our churches to be focusing so much time and attention on conflict and conflict resolution, and it can't be ignored, I understand that, to where we're not living whatever gospel call of Jesus Christ into the community and the world that we're called to do. We're so inward focused on our own conflict. I don't know, that's kind of a broad, I don't know if it's a question, but can you speak to that or just?
Yes, it's why I emphasize that healthy creative congregations are about fulfilling their mission, and that their focus should be on that and not on dealing with conflict. And if they do deal with that and they focus on that, they're better able to avoid conflict. And as I tried to indicate today, I think there are a number of strategies that you can do to anticipate conflict and minimize it before it gets into a big deal. And that's a lot of that is about being sensitive to people, so that people have a feeling that they've been responded to. Even if you can't solve their problem, just responding to them makes them feel as though the church is caring for them in a way that they expect the church to be, a caring institution. I think that we do live in a polarized society, and the problem is that there is a difference between critical reflection and ideology. that we do have this polarization because for some Christians, what Christianity is about is being right. What Christianity is really about, in my opinion, is compassion. Instead of focusing on being right about everything, we should focus on being compassionate people. And that's the focus that we need to have in order to overcome this. And we also need to teach people. I'm a huge proponent of adult education in the church because I think our Sunday school educations as children could only go so far, and then it stopped, and then we didn't engage further in our growth. And we need to keep on learning, lifelong learning in the church as adults. And part of that learning in our tradition of the United Church of Christ is that we reflect upon our biblical interpretations. We reflect upon our beliefs and understandings. We don't say, you have to believe this, because that's not the litmus test for being a Christian. The litmus test is, are you living out God's compassion for all people? So there's a lot of truth to what you're saying about the realities of life in our world today, but the church is one place where we can have a conversation about a whole different focus on things, about how we're treating our neighbors and how we're working for a better world.
I just want to make a comment. As Christians, we are called, to live how the word tells us to do. Going through any type of conflict, the process, scripture should be within that process too.
Yes.
That is important, right?
Yes, I think our theological perspectives can help us, and reflecting on the compassion that's represented in the scriptures is very helpful. My favorite story about conflict in the Bible is when Jesus, after he's entered into Jerusalem, goes to the temple. And sometimes we need to go back and read that story as it's written in Mark, and the other Gospels took their versions from Mark. It was the earliest version of that. But that story, Jesus is performing a demonstration, a 60s type of civil disobedience demonstration, because people came to Jerusalem to change their money at the temple because they were from all over the world. Jewish people were dispersed. When they came to the temple, they had the kind of money that they had from their homeland. So they had to get it changed in order to give their offering to the temple. So Jesus wasn't saying it was bad for there to be money changers there or for them to be collecting money. What he was saying is, I'm going to go through and turn all these tables upside down because then all the money will go everywhere and everybody will be scrambling and they'll be paying attention to the fact that I'm upset about the collaboration that's going on between empire and the community of faith. And I want us as a community of faith to be faithful to our faith and not to the empire. So give to Caesar what's Caesar's, but give God what's God's. So, I'm a preacher too, forgive me, I'm a preacher too. But I think that Jesus is not afraid to say, look at me, I need attention. I have a message I want to proclaim. And people in the church who are in conflict, that's often all they want to do. They want you to take notice of their feelings and their thoughts and respond to them. So they're acting out. They're acting out maybe sometimes like children, throwing a tantrum. And we might feel, well, I don't want to dignify or honor that behavior by listening to them. But we have to. We have to go to them and say, I know you're hurt. I know you're feeling bad about the situation. How can I help? Tell me your story. And together, let's work on that. No, we're not going to leave you to walk out. Any other ideas? Well, some people said today that they were kind of uncomfortable being around me because I had a coat and a tie on. And I didn't wear my aloha shirt, but I wore my aloha tie. And you've been really wonderful and welcoming to me.
You're all good.
So thank you.